Several years ago, at the conclusion of a particularly chaotic gaming session, one of my players looked at me and said, "You know, Mark, you gave us two choices. We could fight our way into the tower, or we could sneak our way into the tower. And we chose neither." Today, we answer the question, why do player characters always push the big red button on this episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide? Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is deeply appreciative to player characters. If it wasn't for the chaotic and insane actions that you perform, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. So thank you for the chaos that you leave in your wake. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. This video is part 3 in my series, The Irrefutable Laws of Storytelling, where we talk about strange behavior that occurs at the gaming table. Sometimes we talk about weird player behavior, sometimes we talk about weird DM behavior, but we try to analyze why gamers behave the way that they do so that we can come up with ideas to improve our games and hopefully tell better stories. Today, I would like to talk about a very famous trope. The big red button. I'm sure you've seen this in movies and TV shows and other media. You have a device that is set up and there is a big button, and when that button is pressed, devastation is sure to follow. Maybe a bomb is unleashed, maybe some other terrible weapon is revealed, but you have a single button that represents untold horror to the people affected. Now, quite clearly, I don't want to talk too much about the big red button itself, because as common as that trope is, there is an aspect of that trope that is far more concerning. You see, any experienced storyteller can tell you that if there is a big red button in your game, your player characters are going to press it. So today, let's talk about that behavior. Let's talk about why it happens and talk about things we need to consider at our gaming tables so that hopefully our stories don't get too out of hand. But first, let me set the stage. Our party's rogue, Kira, is in trouble. She is being pursued by a number of alchemical golems, and the rest of the party is a distance away. She is in danger of being caught and rather violently killed by these powerful constructs. Just a few moments earlier, things had been going rather well. The party was trying to infiltrate a tower of evil alchemists. As they were crossing the lake to the alchemist tower, I had presented the party with a choice. The first option was to sail directly up to the docks in front of the alchemist tower. I had warned the party that there was no way to do this without being seen, so it was very likely that if they took this route, that a confrontation would break out. They would likely have to try to fight their way through the front door. However, I also presented the party a second option. I told them that they could sail around to the back of the island where the alchemists were growing sun orchids, and they could try to sneak through the sun orchid field. Quick aside, sun orchids are flowers that produce a particularly potent alchemical reagent. However, sun orchids are dangerous in their natural state, so dangerous that the alchemists did not harvest the flowers directly, but rather sent alchemical golems out to get the extract that they needed. Sun orchids actually produced a large area of wild magic. At first, as I said, things went really well for the party. However, about halfway through the field, one of the party members had looked at our rogue Kira and said, "Hey, you should steal one of those flowers." When she tried, the dice turned sour. The alchemical golems suddenly started rolling natural 20s left and right on their perception checks, and very quickly, Kira was pursued by and surrounded by these very dangerous constructs. The party had initially thought she would get away from them very easily, so they had kept moving, and now she was separated from her allies and in very real danger. That's when one of the party members decided to help. And by help, I mean they pulled out a Rod of Wonder and fired it into this scene. A Rod of Wonder, for those of you who don't know, is a magical item that produces a completely random effect. So they fired a completely random magical effect into a field of wild magic. This went wrong in a spectacular fashion. If I hadn't rolled the dice myself, I would not have believed what came next. The Rod of Wonder produced a lightning bolt. The wild magic field empowered the lightning bolt. In fact, it empowered the lightning bolt so much that when it struck one of the golem exploded. Alchemical golems explode into a burst of raw elemental energy. But again, this is a field of wild magic. So I check on the wild magic table and yet again roll for an empowering effect. The explosion gets stronger. In fact, it gets so much stronger that it catches the other alchemical golems who all explode as well. And each of those explosions, wild magic effect, also get empowered. Our poor party rogue is standing in the middle of these 4 alchemical golems as they explode, and as I begin to calculate the damage for this explosion, I realize that it has gone through the stratosphere. I'm not even exaggerating here. As a side note, I have this old D20 game called The End. It's a post-apocalyptic role-playing game. That particular game actually has rules for a nuclear explosion. The damage from these exploding alchemical golems combined was 35% higher than the supposed damage of a nuclear explosion in this other game. A mushroom cloud of volatile elemental energy was consuming the poor party rogue. Our party rogue found herself at the center of an explosion that no rational being should have any hope of being able to survive. Now, I'm not going to end the story there because I know that that's kind of a dramatic moment to leave off. I will say this. Our party rogue rolled the most important natural 20 of her entire life, and her character actually did come out of that particular moment alive and well. But that story is just one small fragment of one of the most chaotic game sessions I have ever run as a DM. So let's talk about this for a moment. As a storyteller, I know I've heard many other DMs talk about how their player characters almost have this self-destructive impulse that they are incapable of turning off. Firing a Rod of Wonder into a wild magic field, that's a normal action for many player characters. Quite literally, I had a game where I put a bunch of dinosaurs in a particular area as a very clear sign of your characters should not go over here. And that is literally the first place that my players went. As DMs, when we put obstacles and terrifying objects in our games, our players look at these obstacles and objects and all they see is an opportunity to ramp up the insanity of the story that you're about to tell. In short, player characters will always push the big red button. Why is that? Now, real quick, part of this conversation is this is a game, and a lot of people just enjoy doing stuff because it is fun. There's also a common psychological tick of some players just like interjecting chaos into whatever game they happen to be playing. I definitely think that those are part of the conversation. However, I believe there is another reason why the button is always pushed. Chekov's gun. If you're not familiar with Chekhov's gun, it's kind of this principle of good writing that is commonly used in movies and books. Most famously, Chekhov's gun was stated like this. If there is a gun over the fireplace in Act 1, then someone needs to fire that gun in Act 2. If the gun isn't going to be fired, it shouldn't be in the story at all. That's the rule that Chekhov's gun is describing. For writers, I think that Chekhov's gun is actually a pretty good rule. It helps to cut down on unnecessary or unimportant details in the story that you are trying to construct. But there's a strange problem that happens if Chekhov's gun becomes a guiding psychological principle for players in a role-playing game. Role-playing games are not telling the same kind of stories that novels and movies try to tell. Even the most streamlined RPG has far more narrative flexibility than your typical movie or book. There are lots of things that show up in RPG games that are not nearly as important as Chekhov's gun is, or that Chekhov's gun would imply that they should be. And yet, quite often, we have come to believe that if something shows up in a game, it's mandatory. And I think that this particular psychological impulse explains one of the more chaotic aspects of storytelling. So we have a couple of principles here. Number one, your player characters will push the button. They have been trained psychologically to do so. The second principle is when your players push the button, it could very well destroy your game. These chaotic player actions have the potential to derail an entire game and sometimes to derail an entire campaign. There's a famous incident in my gaming group that we refer to as nuking the plot bridge. Strange how nuclear explosions come up a lot with my gaming group. There's an actual story from our table where a particular explosion ended up wrecking an entire campaign. These moments where the players push the button and the consequences of pushing that button wreck the story you're trying to tell, they're all over the place. So let's talk for a moment about how we can avoid these moments at our games and how we can tell better stories together. Let me just say this, Dungeon Masters, the majority of the responsibility is on you. I know that may come as a bit of a surprise. I've just spent several minutes complaining about chaotic player character actions, but to be entirely honest, this really isn't a player character problem. At least it's not primarily a player character problem. Storytellers, we have a responsibility to consider what elements we are going to introduce to our game. We shouldn't get upset if we introduce something into the story and our player characters use it. Let me give you a far more common example that has happened at a lot of gaming tables. I've heard many storytellers talk about introducing a particular magic item into a game that ends up breaking the game. When the storyteller designed the item, they were thinking about how cool this item would be and how much fun that the party was going to have using this item. But once they introduce it into the story, they don't realize that the mechanics of the item, in one fashion or another, ends up breaking the game and ends up stealing the fun from the story that the group is trying to tell together. Sometimes, in our excitement to tell unique and fun and interesting stories, we introduce elements to our stories that we haven't really considered the consequences of. And sometimes the consequences of the things we introduce can do some very real damage to the stories that they tell. Storytellers, think of it this way. We have a reverse Chekov's gun rule. If you don't want the gun to fire in Act 2, don't include it in Act 1. If there is a particular thing that has the potential to derail your story, don't put it there. Going back to that field of wild magic and those crazy flowers, I willingly put those elements into my story. Now, I will go ahead and tell you there were some crazy once-in-a-lifetime rolls that went into the chaos of that particular story. I managed to roll the same number on a D100 5 times in a row. I managed to roll several natural 20s that escalated that situation in a way that I didn't anticipate it being escalated. There was definitely some niche cases to that story that I didn't expect. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who chose to put those wild magic flowers in my game. I'm the one who chose to give my party the chance to steal a wild magic flower. So, at the end of the day, the responsibility was on me to deal with the consequences of that item and that action in my story. Now, I am very grateful that in the list of long and crazy rolls that night produced, that our party rogue, Kira, rolled that all-important natural 20 to save her life at the most important moment. I appreciate that the crazy dice rolls continued on to her particular roll. But the reality is, it was my responsibility to cope with the consequences of the element I introduced. So storytellers, let me just encourage you. When you are brainstorming for your sessions and when you are brainstorming for your games, consider very carefully the consequences of the elements and items that you are putting into your game, and make sure you're ready for those things to be used. And if you're not, it is not time for those things to appear in your stories. So now, let me talk to players for a few minutes. Players, you do have some responsibility in this conversation. Yes, I believe that the big red button issue is very much the DM's responsibility. I do believe storytellers should carefully consider what they are putting into their games. However, you are part of the game, and you also bear some responsibility in helping to tell a good story at your table. Players, before you act in a role-playing game, try to be mindful of the consequences of the actions that you're taking. Chekov's gun may be a fantastic rule for a novel or a movie, but it's actually a really bad rule at a gaming table. PCs have far more agency and freedom than a character in a novel or a movie ever will, and therefore the consequences of your actions are far more dramatic than the consequences of an action in a novel or a movie. When you act, you are fundamentally changing the nature of the story that you're telling together at your table. I don't care how much you accuse your DM of railroading. I promise you, you have more freedom than you realize. That's why we need to think about the consequences of the actions that we're going to perform in our games. Thankfully, there is another media out there that can help us with this particular mindset, and that media is video games. Video games, especially more recent video games, have really embraced the concept of an open and living world. When you are in a video game, you have so many options and opportunities that it is truly mind-blowing. I love opening up a video game and being able to travel around and see all kinds of different things that have been created and included in that particular game. It is fascinating discovering everything that is out there. And a lot of video games, if you are not careful when you are exploring, you are going to run into something that you cannot handle. Here recently, I started playing Pathfinder Kingmaker, and I was exploring a particular area of the map and fighting some wargs and wolves and other low-level monsters. And all of a sudden, I came across a challenge rating 18 Craig Lenorm. My party was nowhere near strong enough for that encounter, and thankfully I was smart enough to turn around and run the other way. If I had tried to engage that particular enemy, I definitely would have been killed. This is an area where we really need to think about our characters the way we would in a video game, rather than we would if that character were in a novel or in a movie. We need to realize that the world of a pen and paper role-playing game is far more open and dynamic and is far more similar to those open world video games, and we need to make choices that represent that dynamic. We need to realize that the consequences of our choices are far wider ranging than the consequences of a choice in a novel or a movie. So players, please take a moment and consider the actions that you're going to perform. Consider the potential consequences of those actions, and make sure you're ready for whatever is going to happen to the story that you are telling together. Sometimes, players, it's better not to push the big red button, because if you were thinking like a character in that world, you know that the big red button is actually a very dangerous thing. So let's summarize what we've talked about today. Today we've been talking about the big red button. And more specifically, we've been talking about the fact that player characters love to push the big red button. It seems like player characters do not care about the chaos that their actions will inevitably unleash. We've been talking about Chekov's gun. If there is a gun over the fireplace in Act 1, the gun must be fired in Act 2. That is a principle of good writing, both in movies and in novels. But we've also talked about how Chekov's gun is not a very good rule for role-playing games. We've talked to DMs. We've talked about the DM side of the equation. Storytellers, we need to be very mindful of the elements that we include in our game. We should not get upset if our player characters choose to use the items and elements we include in our story. As a result, we need to think very carefully about what we include in the game to make sure that we're prepared for the consequences of whatever we have chosen to put in front of our players. We've also talked to players, and we've talked about how you have a responsibility in the story that your group is telling together. Role-playing games are not novels and they're not movies, which means that the choices that you make are far more impactful than they would be in other medias. We've compared role-playing games to open-world video games, and we've talked about how in open-world video games, often there are areas or monsters that your character is simply not strong enough to face. We've talked about applying that mentality to role-playing games as well, and knowing when it's important to step back and retreat from a particular area rather than engaging with that area. We've talked about recognizing how the consequences of our actions in role-playing games are far more dynamic, and so we need to be more considerate about what we do at the gaming table. Chekhov's gun may be good writing for novels and movies, but I think that Chekhov's gun is a poor principle for role-playing games. However, I think when storytellers and players are conscious of that tendency, we can avoid the worst effects on our stories and on our games. But let me throw the conversation over to you. What is your favorite Chekhov's gun moment at your gaming table? Share your favorite stories of when your party pushed the big red button, and tell us about how everything went crazy as a result. Leave your stories in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please like the video and share it. If you want to see more of my content, please subscribe to the channel. I try to put out a video every week. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic day. Hello everyone, this is Mark with the post-credits volunteer shout-out. I like to take a few moments at the end of all of my videos and talk about volunteerism and encourage you to get involved in volunteering. I serve as a chaplain and volunteer coordinator for a nonprofit organization. I get to see the real-world impact of volunteers every day at my job, and I know that volunteers are a blessing to the community, and I know that volunteers change the world around them every single day. I would like to offer a quick story about how volunteerism helped me to learn to appreciate some of the blessings I have in my life. Several years ago, I was part of a ministry team that went down to Jamaica to help a poor community start an organic farm. It was a very interesting mission project that I was part of, and it was very creative. They were doing organic farming with this community because it was actually a more long-term business model that the community could use to try to build resources. It was very intelligently designed, and I was actually part of one of the first mission teams that was helping to get this farming project going. It was very, very fascinating work. I spent the better part of a week in a jungle cutting down trees and helping build different things for this farm. It was very difficult work, it was very physical work, and it was a very exciting week of my life. And I remember at the end of that week, we had about a half a day to go around one of the resort cities in Jamaica and just kind of relax from all the work that we were doing before we flew home the next day. I remember that afternoon, I was walking down the street and I walked into a Burger King. And when I walked into the Burger King, I did this. I literally jumped out of my skin. And at first, I couldn't figure out why. Why should a Burger King scare me? And then I realized what it was. I was standing under the air conditioner. I had spent a week in a jungle with a machete doing hard labor. I had spent a week without air conditioning. And in that moment, when I first walked back into an air-conditioned building, it actually startled me. And that moment has stuck with me for a decade. It's been 10 years, but I still remember that afternoon where air conditioning startled me. And I have to say, I have appreciated the blessings that I have in my life so much more now. The perspective that volunteering gave me has helped me to realize that I am truly a blessed individual and I truly have a wonderful life. And so let me encourage you, get involved with volunteering. It truly changes your perspective and it truly helps you see the blessings and the golden things that you have going in your life. So find your passion, get out there, volunteer, and make the world a better place. Have a fantastic day.